This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is Outbreak. It is a book by Robert Bartholomew, who is my guest. It talks about the way people react to things, how they overreact to things, and other things of that nature. The conversation will begin when we return. Robert Bartholomew is my guest, and he will be talking about his latest book, Outbreak, which deals with the way that human beings experience things. Before we get into the book, I'd like to give him a few minutes, as I do all my guests, to explain who he is, his interest in the fields that are covered within the book, and what prompted the writing of the book. So first of all, welcome, Robert. If you could give a little bit of background about who you are.
Sure. Well, look, thank you for having me. I'm Robert Bartholomew. I'm an honorary senior lecturer in the Department of Psychological Medicine at the University of Auckland here in New Zealand. I grew up in upstate New York on a dairy farm on Lake Champlain, and a beautiful area up there. And I grew up interested in phenomena like UFOs, ghosts, Bigfoot, near-death experiences, and all kinds of mysteries in general. And when I went into sociology at the State University of New York at Plattsburgh on the Canadian border, and then at the State University of New York at Albany, I was always interested in looking at that phenomena, and actually did a master's thesis at SUNY Albany on the history and sociology of close encounter reports. So um, I am a sympathetic skeptic. I need to see the dead space alien or Bigfoot in front of me. And, you have to go with science. For example, with Bigfoot, throughout the entire history of the world, there's no body, fossils, bones, or DNA evidence. Yet people continue to report sightings around the world. So how would you explain that? I look for known sociological, psychological, folkloric explanations. I am a mainstream scientist. I am down the line, not out there. All of my views would be within the realm of mainstream science. And I think that you don't need to search for unicorns when you hear the sound of hoofbeats. You can search for horses or cows, right? But so many people out there are led by their wanting to believe in something. And I think that is part of the phenomena that I'm looking at now. Fads, crazes, manias, so-called hysterias, cults, urban legends, rumors, rumor panics, all these different phenomena would fall under the classification of collective behavior. And that's what I do in the book with Hilary Evans, who was a well-known British historian and author, the owner of the Mary Evans Picture Library in London, which is still going today, being run by his daughter. And Hilary had an interest in historical books, particularly from the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, and he spoke several different languages. So we were able to call a lot of this early literature that's never really been discussed before from a variety of languages and some really unusual cases.
It's interesting. Just before I called you about 20, 30 minutes ago, I was watching this video on YouTube, which was there were headlines a few months ago. Physicists prove that reality may not exist, and what they did was they were talking about superposition and Schrodinger's cat, and how we can choose reality or whatnot. And it's funny because Schrodinger, Erwin Schrodinger, when he came up with the idea of the cat in the box, is it alive or dead? And you don't know until you look. Even he chose that thought experiment to show how absurd it is that the cat is either dead or alive in reality, and yet it has been so misinterpreted that you get people online doing whole videos that there are two cats and we don't know which cat is alive or dead. If what, and it's like, but so here you have a perfect example of where a scientist was just sort of making fun of the whole idea of some of these outrageous kind of belief systems, and it led to another belief system or another belief that totally misconstrued what he was actually stating. Is misconstrual a big part of your work?
Absolutely. And human perceptual fallibility and memory reconstruction, human beings are very fallible creatures. We are so prone to making mistakes. And the other thing is, people will say, well, seeing is believing. No, it's not seeing is believing. It's believing is seeing. Because in believing, that gives you a certain perceptual view of the world. And for example, if you believe in Bigfoot, or if you believe in space aliens traversing the skies, believing in that, or fairies, gives you a perceptual set and outlook on the world that holds those potential realities. So then a rustling in the woods becomes a Bigfoot because perceptually we kind of fill in the rest. Or a light in the sky becomes not an unidentified flying object, it becomes an alien spacecraft, from another planet. So, and the other aspect here is we have to be very careful because a lot of the phenomena that I look at touch on the potential for, is there life after death? And that being the case, there is a built-in inherent wanting to believe, right? The old saying, I want to believe. And that's very powerful. It's not like somebody claims to see a ghost. The fact that somebody claims to see a ghost is very powerful because that is potentially proof of life after death. So we have to be very careful here that we don't fool ourselves. What is it Carl Sagan once said? Wherever we have strong emotions, we're liable to fool ourselves. And what's so fascinating to me is when you look at the book Outbreak and all of the various cases, history never repeats itself, but it rhymes. And that's what you're seeing with Outbreak. You're seeing the rhyming of history. All these cases that aren't the same, but they're pretty similar. And I'll give you an example from the book. In 1985, in parts of Ireland, there were these people that went to church grottos at dusk, and somebody said that they were sitting there kneeling and staring at a statue of the Virgin Mary, and it appeared to move. Before long, you had hundreds of people flocking to these grottos at dusk, staring at statues of the Virgin Mary, and it was appearing to move. And this went on for much of the year 1985. What's so interesting is there was a psychologist that looked at it there, and it's basically the autokinetic effect, right? Where objects, when you stare at them, particularly as the environment starts to get dark, can appear to move. And what's so fascinating to me is when we were researching this book, I think it was the 14th or 15th century, something very similar happened across Italy. People were going to churches and staring at statues, and they were appearing to move. It was a massive thing. And so what happened in 1985 happened with the backdrop of science from the 21st century, right? But back then, they didn't have the benefit of all that science. And we do. And it's fascinating how this happened before, and it just happens again, and it'll probably happen again. It just morphs to take a slightly different form to make it more palatable and plausible for today's reality. And that's the key word in all of these phenomena that people latch onto: plausibility. Yeah. If it's plausible and people think it's real, then believing can become seeing.
Yeah. And just so people know, your book is in alphabetical order. Like it starts off with the A's, goes through the Z's, and it deals with many cases. It's a nice, handy way to look at things. But we'll start off from the beginning, since you had mentioned alien abduction. So we'll start with the A's. And it's interesting you talked about memory, because I know, for example, in my own mind, you know, even before I ever read of experiments where there's a professor in a room and someone runs in and steals one of his papers or something runs out, and then they say to the class, "Were you paying attention? You know, was it
That's
a
right.
tall guy, a short guy, a woman, a black guy, a white guy, etc. What did he take?" And people have their own realities, which is why when people say you know, I have my own truth, in a sense, it's true. There's reality is the baseline. Our truth is always a comment on that reality, don't you think?
That's right. About 25 years ago, I was at James Cook University in North Queensland, Australia, studying for my PhD. And one night, I walked up to the university computer lab. It was in the evening, and one of the graduate students there, Eve, she goes, Robert, she goes, you are a fantastic dancer. I said, what are you talking about? She said, oh, last night I saw you in the city and you were just fantastic. And I said, no, that wasn't me. And she goes, no, it was you. And I thought to myself, what if instead of dancing, I had stabbed somebody and run out, right? Or the person they thought was me.
Yeah.
The police would be looking for me. And all we have to do is look at the hundreds of people who have been convicted of heinous crimes, were on death row, or even executed, who later were exonerated through DNA evidence.
Yeah.
And what I think is so fascinating is how we get it wrong so often. For example, on October 30th of 1938, in the studios of WABC in New York City, as the second hand was sweeping across the 8, you had the famous Orson Welles War of the Worlds radio broadcast based on the adaptation of the book by H.G. Wells, no relation, The War of the Worlds, that Martians were invading parts of New York and New Jersey. What's so fascinating about that is that during that broadcast, they described these Martians on these giant machines firing heat rays in poison gas. There are a number of cases where people called police to say they could feel the heat rays as described on the radio. And they were coughing and choking on the poison gas and shoving rags under their doors and in keyholes. And in some cases, they said they were looking in the distance and they thought they could see the giant Martian machines as they were described. And so human beings are very fallible. There was a famous case in Rotterdam a number of years ago where a panda escaped from a zoo. And the police were searching for this panda all over the city. There were dozens of reports chasing it through people's backyards day after day. And then they found the panda. It was dead. It had been hit by a train maybe 100 meters from where it had escaped. It was very clear that it had died right away and had not been on the run for several days. Yet people were reporting seeing the panda everywhere. And so what is it Voltaire said? If God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him or her. The same here. I mean, it's this belief system that also drives the reports. And that's why 200 years ago, 300 years ago, people were seeing fairies. And in some places in Europe, they still see fairies today. It's the power of a belief to alter your perceptual set of the world, and how if you believe it, then it is certainly plausible.
Yeah. Well, let me just follow up with a few points, and we'll go point by point on that. Just since this book, it's one of those things where you talk about one thing, it links to another, and so you have this opening up, fractalizing, opening up of things.
Yeah.
What's interesting, what you mentioned about the War of the Worlds thing is, this is 1938, so it's before even the London Blitz, so it's before World War II. So the last experience that the Western world has had of war is World War I. And what did they have? Flamethrowers and gases. And what you just described was what would have been in the underlying fear. Now, if that had been 100 years earlier and we'd had radio, maybe it would have been swords or other whatever technology of the day, just like with the Texas airship and the airships of 1897 versus UFOs. So there's a perfect example of what was underlying. Because if Wells or someone did something on the internet and did a hoax of that scale, it would probably be something having to do with government agents and the whole kind of zeitgeist of today rather than the zeitgeist of the 30s.
Yeah, and that's a really important point. Outbreaks of so-called mass hysteria, mass psychogenic illness, social panics, just panics in general, flight panics, they never happen in isolation. There's always a unique social, cultural, religious, historical backdrop to these things. And so if you take away and strip away all of that historical backdrop, maybe you don't get the 1938 War of the Worlds scare, or certainly the reaction to the extent it was. Certain percentage of people, and it was a significant percentage, in Hadley Cantrill's study on the Martian invasion scare of 1938, he found that a number of people actually thought the announcer had gotten it wrong in that it was a German Zeppelin and it was a poison gas attack on the United States. So people have these notions in their minds, and it really helps to mold and shape the actual content of the actual event as it happens, as it's perceived.
Yeah, I want to talk about alien abductions and the methodology or the way the system goes or the stories go. But I want to just give you a brief little anecdote. I grew up in a very Goodfellas type neighborhood, the Scorsese film, a lot of goombas and gangsters and a lot of crime and whatnot. So when I was in my pre-teens, I guess you would call it, or now I guess they call it the tweens, I had a series of dreams where I would wake up, what I now would consider, I guess, sleep paralysis, and standing above me were very sort of odd creatures with sort of glowing red eyes, but they were dressed like gangsters looking over me, and I couldn't move, and I would sometimes feel like some pounding. And I had this dream over the course of a couple of summers, maybe a handful of times. And then a few years later, I discovered alien abduction stuff from looking at books and whatnot. And with the exception of the beings looking different and they're being garbed in gangster-like things, this is an alien abduction or a fairy abduction. But my mind, having grown up there, used what was handy to me to have that. Now, that doesn't mean that they were gangster-like insectoids or whatever, but to me, that's a powerful way to show how the context matters. Because when alien abductions first happened, there were lots of different types of aliens. Then it only became the black-eyed, bug-eyed, green, gray aliens of communion type fame after the Hills. So it seems to me there has to be a cultural context, because if this was really objective reality, there would be a lot of different stories. They wouldn't conform so easily.
Yeah, and if you go back in time during the Middle Ages, it was the incubus, succubus,
Yeah.
male and female demons, and there's a feeling that it's on top of your chest.
Yeah.
And there's a man that wrote a book on this from Canada, David Herford, called The Terror That Comes in the Night.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like the modern day evolution of the incubus, succubus.
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of psychological phenomena and conditions where they can be easily mistranslated as some kind of supernatural phenomena. It also sounds like you may have had possibly some sleep paralysis.
Yeah.
And then there's also the possibility, if it was in color and quite bright at times, that it could be lucid dreams as well. You have all these things that in the past people weren't familiar with, but now in the 21st century we know about these phenomena and are better able to understand them. For instance, The Conjuring, that clearly had the mother in that case was having very vivid experiences with lucid dreaming.
Was this the Bud
And there were
Hopkins book? Was this a book by Bud Hopkins, the missing time guy?
uh, no, the Conjuring, the one there with Ed and Lorraine Warren,
Oh, okay,
the
okay, okay,
supernatural
okay.
movie and stuff like
Yeah,
that.
okay.
But yeah, Bud Hopkins was an interesting character. You know, they go out and they interview these people who think they may have missing time, and they have this idea about, well, maybe we were abducted, and then the regressive hypnosis. And that really drove what was going on. The regressive hypnosis, and you had a number of psychiatrists or psychologists who would go out and they would specialize in regressively doing people. And as a result of that, that was a main driver in the mid 60s, late 60s, after the famous Betty and Barney Hill case,
Yeah.
that drove the alien abduction phenomena and turned it into another direction. But I have no doubt if you thought you were abducted by fairies and then you went to a psychologist and had them regress you, that you talk about meeting the fairy people, and you know, it's just going to reflect, as you were saying, your cultural backdrop.
Yeah, the Washington Irving story about the little people, and he sleeps for 20 years and comes back to his town. That's you know, I mean, that's fiction, but it was, you know, is based upon what people had claimed about in the Adirondacks, the local mythology there. But just speaking of Bud Hopkins, I mean, I remember when I picked up the book in like '85, Missing Time, his first book, and I started reading it. I was just browsing through the stuff, and I started reading it, and I bought the book, and I'm like, boy, this was very similar to what I experienced. And I wrote to him with my experience, with this, what I said, these sort of gangster-like things, and a few other things, and he didn't have anything to investigate it, which told me that he was selectively pruning things before he really investigating. So he wanted to develop a narrative, a mythos, and if anything, well, we can't have, you know, aliens or whatever creatures having missing time with people, and they don't look like the communion aliens. And I think he may not have been doing it even knowingly, but I think certainly people like him that have been, you know, writing these types of books for 40 or more years have certainly been actively shaping the phenomena that they report on, whether it's aliens or even now with the internet and Slender Man type stuff.
Look, this is still happening today, right now as we speak, with this Havana syndrome, because right after, in August of 2017, when the State Department announced that the diplomats in Cuba might be under attack by some kind of acoustical weapon, now it's supposedly a microwave weapon, but when they announced that, you had people who, about 36 of them, who said that they had been in those same areas in Cuba over the last several years and had very similar experiences, yet the government didn't want anything to do with them. That if you were a US diplomat and had the same experience, they would interview you as a possible victim of Havana syndrome. Yet if you were one of these tourists who'd gone there, and had very similar symptoms and heard very similar sounds, they did not want to talk with you, or to, they were saying, oh, just go to your neurologist. And so it's something that's being driven and shaped by the people who are recording it.
So let's move to something a little bit less dark. Let's talk about fads in general, because you talk about pole sitting, the hula hoop, and numerous other fads. What is the thing that drives a fad? Is it simply good marketing, or is it something in the zeitgeist that then gets propelled by the marketing as it gains steam, or is it either?
I think it's a series of fortunate events where it's fortunate if you have a whole bunch of those products at that time, right? And a good way to look at fads is the hula hoop. that was the greatest fad of the 20th century. It was a remarkable fad. And when did it happen? It didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened right at the time when Elvis Presley had gone on television, and they wouldn't show him from the waist down swiveling his hips. And that was the time when, you know, people were very conservative, and yet the hula hoop allowed people publicly to swivel their hips and get away with all this. There were even pictures from the period of nuns doing it, right?
Yeah.
And so it was very convenient. It gave us this opportunity to do something we couldn't ordinarily. You couldn't go out and just start swiveling your hips. But if you had a hula hoop, you know, you were able to do that. And it just blew up around the world. And then it died. And there have been many attempts to bring it back, and they have not been very successful at all. It's a confluence of factors that hit just right. And of course, that was marketed. They took this bamboo hoop that was used in some of the Pacific Islands that had then kind of migrated to Australia, and the Australians were using it in their gym classes. And one of the people that marketed this, he went to California and some of the chic high schools, and he gave it to some of the students there and had them doing it, and kind of started it that way, because fads tend to start with, you know, people of higher status and then spread down. I mean, if you look at the Frisbee, right? There were Yale University students out on the lawn, and they would buy these Frisbee pies from the Frisbee Pie Company. There were these metal tins, and once they ate the pie, they would fling them around on the campus. And so it started there, and then, you know, you've got students, high status being at Yale, right? And then it gradually spread. So fads are very interesting, but they usually don't last long. I mean, has the Frisbee endured? To a certain extent, it has, more than almost any other fad, to the point where you wouldn't call it a fad. But most of these wane, like Davy Crockett coonskin hats. You know, there aren't many of those around right now. Hair ironing from the early 60s, where girls would put their hair on the ironing board and iron their hair to straighten it. The wacky wall walker. There's a whole bunch of these that they just blow up, and then they die away. And the thing is, if you have some fad item, like a mood ring, I remember when the mood rings came out. If you get a mood ring, it's like, wow, I want that. You know, but then when everybody has it, then it's not novel anymore. And then it declines, and you go on to something else. So fads don't usually last more than, say, a few months. And then you get unusual fads like streaking, right, which I lived through in the early 1970s, which was fascinating. Or in the 50s, they had the panty raids, right? That was another fad. Those are short-lived and seen as kind of funny at the time, but you don't want to push it too much. And then it kind of stopped, with the rare exception of now somebody streaking in front of a Yankees game and running out. And
Well, how do you know if something's going to be a fad or not? For example, just to use music, rock and roll has been around for 70 some years. Rap has been around going on 40 years, but disco only lasted maybe 4 or 5 years in its heyday. So disco might be considered a fad then?
You could consider disco a fad. It's like mass psychogenic illness in a way. How do you know that's a case of mass psychogenic illness? You don't. And you have to assume when it happens that, well, maybe these people have been poisoned and you need to do the tests, right? You can't just say, oh, I think that all these people who think they've been poisoned, we're not going to bring them to the hospital. I think it's mass hysteria, right? No, bring them to the hospital, check it out, do tests. With a fad, it's difficult to tell at the time, right? And so they are best understood retrospectively.
Yeah.
But that's the same thing with mass psychogenic illness. Retrospectively, it all makes sense.
Yeah.
But when it's happening, it's you need that time element to be able to adequately assess that. However, some things like Beyblades or there's so many fads out there. Chia pets,
Yeah.
ant farms. It looks pretty
Pet rocks.
obvious at the time. What's that?
Pet rocks.
Yeah. I mean, at the time, if I were a fad expert, I would have said, this probably isn't going to last.
Yeah. There's so many things that are interesting that I'd like to talk about. So like I said, I'm just going to pick and choose some of the more interesting ones. One of the things that probably is a good thing to talk about, because it's so, in a sense, bizarre, but yet it's not bizarre in the way of alien abductions, is glossolalia. I would think, and this is what most people call speaking in tongues kind of thing, right? I would think that it's also related to the claims of people who said that their child was born speaking perfect Latin, at birth or something. What is the glossolalia story, for those who don't know what the term is?
Well, that's speaking in tongues.
Yeah.
And in these charismatic religious sects, you often get people who will start speaking in what seems like a foreign language, right? But there's been a lot of studies done on this where you look at that, and there's other phenomena that are elicited there too, where people start, there's the famous Toronto blessing movement, right? Where when you get into a structured religious setting, people will start doing behaviors, and then they'll get echoed. For example, there's the holy laugh from the Toronto blessing movement, which started in East Africa, by the way, and where somebody, as they're worshiping and they get whipped up emotionally, a person starts to laugh out loud. And then another person starts laughing. Then you get all these people in the room laughing, right? And it's very contagious. And then someone will, because there are references to it in the Bible, start roaring like a lion. And then before long, you get the whole room, people are roaring like a lion. But some of these people are also going into altered states of consciousness, trance-like states. And there's all kinds of psychological phenomena that people can mistake for a religious experience. And look, that's their own individual interpretation, what they want to do with that. But there's a famous book written by William Sargent in the late 50s or early 60s called Battle for the Mind, in which he looked at all over the world phenomena of people in small religious groups or cultural settings where you get intense emotions and beliefs, and they go into trance-like states. They might speak in tongues with what seems to be a strange foreign language. They might go into a trance-like state and run around like a monkey and appear like they've turned into a monkey. It reflects the power of culture, because under these states, and it usually takes a while to build up when you go into a trance-like state like that, you get people dissociating and going into altered states of consciousness. And to take a strand from this and how the book is related to so many things, you take something like that, which reflects culture, right? Today, if somebody believes in demons, and there are a number of cases like this in parts of Africa that happen today, where somebody goes into a trance-like state and acts like they're possessed by a demon, and they have a deep, gruff voice, like there's a demon inside them. Yeah. But the interesting thing is, when you go back through history, in the Middle Ages, that generally didn't happen. Instead, you had, for example, in medieval European nunneries, these nuns who would go into trance-like states under tremendous stress over long periods of time. One goes, then another goes, then another goes, and they would start meowing like cats. There are many cases in the Middle Ages of nuns meowing like cats, getting on all fours and barking like dogs. And this would go on for hours. And it would wax and wane for years because it was believed to be triggered by demons. And what was happening was, you have to look at the context. If you look at that today, it's just like bonkers. It's like, how is that possible? But when you go back and look at the context from the period, what was going on? At the time, if you had a daughter in certain parts of Europe, it was another mouth to feed. A male child was more beneficial to the family. So there were cases where families would take one of their young daughters and give them to a monastery, a strict one, right? Where these outbreaks were happening was these strictest monasteries where you would go there and you were forced to take vows of chastity, vows of poverty. You might have to say on certain days the Our Father or Hail Mary 800 times, right? You would sleep on maybe the floor with just some straw and have a very basic diet because you wanted to show how pious and devout you were. And it was supposed to give you divine favor. It was in these places, the strictest places, where you had these outbreaks of demonic possession. All of a sudden, a nun would start twitching, shaking, go into altered states of consciousness, and it would wax and wane for months and often years. And they were almost like daily soap operas where people from the community would come in and watch these things play out. And they would have exorcists come from nearby areas. The church would bring them in and try to exorcise the demons because it was believed that they were possessed by demons. And their experiences, their altered states of consciousness reflected the culture of the period. And it's a fascinating series of outbreaks. There were, I'll tell you, you can't underestimate the number of cases or intensity of these cases that happened in Europe during the latter Middle Ages in these convents. Many of them went on for years and years. And so what was happening here is this was the type of mass psychogenic illness where you get prolonged stress. And under prolonged stress, the nerves and neurons that send messages to the brain get garbled. So you get the twitching, you get the shaking, you get the altered states of consciousness. It's the same type of what I would call motor hysteria that happened in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692 with those young girls and spread. Because what people don't realize is there's two main types of mass hysteria, mass psychogenic illness. There's the motor type that involves people under prolonged stress, where the altered states of consciousness still happen today in parts of Africa and Asia, usually backward areas where they believe in demons. And they're under this prolonged, strict regimen, the most strictest schools. So you got the other type of mass psychogenic illness, which is much more common in Western countries, where there's no pre-existing group tension. They're exposed to a strange smell, and there's a belief that that smell is some kind of toxin, right? I'll give you a good example. Right after September 11th, I think it was October of 2001, you had a man at a subway station in Maryland, and he had a container of liquid, and he started spraying people outside the subway system. And they grabbed him, they knocked him down, they got the container. People were having breathing problems, itchy eyes, watering eyes, difficulty seeing, headaches, nausea. They rushed these people to the hospital, and they quickly recovered. And it turned out he had something like Windex that he had sprayed on people. A harmless, unless you're drinking it, right, or you're spraying it directly in your eyes, relatively harmless thing that we are exposed to all the time if you're cleaning your windows. and you don't think it's going to harm you. But in this scenario, they thought it was going to harm them. They thought it was probably some type of terrorist attack that was going on, and they reacted that way. So what you've got is, you've asked me a question about glossolalia, and we've gone into so many different areas because that's what the book does, and that's what the phenomena is. It's so interrelated with these cases.
Well, it brings up the mad gases that you were talking about. I'd only heard of the mad gas of Mattoon. I didn't know about the 3 or 4 others that you talk about. But I wanted to get back, though, with the tyros and the novitiate nuns and whatnot. That remind me of like the laughing syndrome in Africa that you wrote about. But wouldn't most of that, though, I mean, it seems a modern perspective on these medieval nuns would be that they were rebelling against the strictures of the nunnery. And therefore, one nun says, oh, Sister Susan is acting like a fruitcake. If I act like a fruitcake like her, maybe I'll get a few more privileges. So I would think that there's probably some of that psychological pressure, but also a bit of the copycat syndrome, no?
Absolutely. But also some of the behaviors they were exhibiting, the contractures and convulsions. I mean, you can't fake that. So it's a combination of factors. Just like in Salem, people say, oh, what happened in Salem was ergot poisoning. They had a rainy season, there was a fungus there, and these young girls went on an LSD trip, right? That's one of the claims with Salem. And certainly there was histrionics going on. There was some play acting, but certain things you can't play act. And clearly they were also experiencing mass psychogenic illness and so-called hysteria. And when you go back and look at that, for instance, if it was ergot poisoning, there are modern day cases of ergot poisoning, for example, in France, where people ate bread that had the ergot fungus. These people were stark, raving crazy. I mean, they had to tie them down in their beds. They were trying to jump out of windows. They were having these incredible hallucinations. That's not what happened in Salem. In Salem, they would start twitching, shaking, go into convulsions. They would make accusations. So it was partly conscious, partly subconscious. At times they would go into trance-like states. At other times they were more cognizant of what they were doing. But all of a sudden, they would go from apparently stark raving crazy to stone cold sober. And just right in the moment, everything is normal again. And that's not possible. That's like asking you to drink a bottle of vodka and then 20 minutes later asking you to act normally again. It's just not possible, especially with ergot poison. It just doesn't wear off like that.
Yeah, it also brings to mind one of the more interesting things before I even read this book, which I found many different things I'd never even heard of. The Our Lady of Fatima incident in 1917 in Portugal, seems to be the biggest or most well-known case of where people are like, oh, look up there, don't you see it? And everyone starts looking up and pointing at something, even though they don't see it, that seems to be quite related too, and that it's that copycat syndrome that when you get a lot of people, we are social animals, so we want to conform, generally speaking.
Yeah, and again, believing is seeing.
Yeah.
There was a famous experiment done by a group of sociologists headed by Melvin Tooman in the 1950s, where these children in Puerto Rico claimed to be in contact with the Virgin Mary, and there was going to be an appearance. And tens of thousands of people flocked there. And they were interviewing people during the so-called appearance where they thought they could see the Virgin in the sky. And some people saw nothing. Other people saw things. And when you stare at objects, particularly the sun, right, you can, it can give you, you don't normally do that, right? So you can be fooled by that. Just like when there's a UFO sighting wave, what do people do? They do something they don't ordinarily do. They go outside and they start staring at the sky and staring at lights in the sky. And it's like, oh, I've never seen that before. That light changed from red to green to yellow, back to white, and then to red again. Yeah, it's called the scintillation effect. And stars and planets can appear to move. The autokinetic effect. So people aren't ordinarily familiar with that, and they're doing things they ordinarily wouldn't do. I mean, when you go to places like Fatima and Lourdes, you get people going there who claim to be healed. And there was a guy who came to my University of Flinders in South Australia, a number of years ago, and he claimed to be a faith healer. He held the Bible. And this student, who I knew, she definitely was being truthful. She hadn't been able to touch her toes for years. And he had her touch the Bible, and she did. And she bent over, and she touched her toes. And it was like a miracle. Now, the thing was, a couple of weeks later, she couldn't touch her toes again. And I guess the miracle wore off. But I mean, it's the power of belief.
Placebo.
The adrenaline.
That would have been a placebo effect kind of thing, probably, too, even.
Yeah, placebo effect. And look, at Lourdes, at Fatima, a lot of people go there to be healed because they have health issues. And what's the old saying? When you go to Fatima, you see a lot of piles of crutches and piles of wheelchairs where people have walked away. But you don't see many wooden legs, right?
Yeah.
So if it's truly a miracle, I'd like to see somebody come with a wooden leg and then walk away with a real leg.
Well, I wanted to just picking up on that. Let's see what you had mentioned the Puerto Rico incident in the 1950s. I'm sure from what you have said about that, if you've ever seen Federico Fellini's film La Dolce Vita, there's one of the segments there where little children are seeing the Virgin Mary, and camera crews and radio crews and film crews of the day are there, and the kids are saying, "She's over there," and the whole 300 or 400 people run that way. She's over here, and then there's a holy tree where they saw it, and the people just start ripping the tree apart. I mean, that it's just a great example of that.
It's interesting when you get these episodes that happen. People start over scrutinizing their environment. So if you look at a Bigfoot outbreak, a chupacabra wave, a UFO sighting wave, you get an initial sensational case, which you had with the Mad Gasser of Mattoon, which you had with the Mad Gasser of Bonneville County in Virginia. You get an initial sensational case, gets reported in the media, and then people start over scrutinizing their environment and their bodies for evidence of this new thing. And and it works in different ways. In 1954, there was atomic bomb testing that was going on in the Pacific by the United States on these different atolls. And after one of these tests, there were reports in the Pacific Northwest of the United States that people thought they could see fallout coming down from the sky, and they thought it was radioactive. It was going to cause people to get sick. And a number of residents in the vicinity of Seattle started seeing these tiny pit marks on their windshields, pit marks they'd never seen before. And it became so serious that the governor of Washington State telephoned President Eisenhower and asked for assistance. Experts came in, university researchers came in, and they examined the windshields. And what they found was those pit marks had always been there. And what was going on was, because of all the publicity and concern that they may be radioactive fallout, instead of looking through their windshields as they always had, they started looking at their windshields. It's the same when somebody says there might be a toxic odor. You start monitoring your body more carefully with this Havana syndrome stuff, right? Havana syndrome, a lot of that's not mass psychogenic illness. It's people having a headache and some health incident and thinking, oh, this must be Havana syndrome when you were going to have it anyway,
Yeah.
right? And the symptoms of Havana syndrome are so vague: dizziness, fatigue, difficulty concentrating, insomnia. They're so vague as to have every human being who's ever lived since cave person times having symptoms like this and any given week of their life. But now all of a sudden there's a new label, Havana syndrome.
Yeah. Well, you know, it reminds me of the famous anecdote that Alfred Hitchcock once said. He said, "Here's the way that you build suspense. If I write a scene and there's a man and a woman at a cafe and they're talking and they're just gabbing, gossipy or whatnot, that's one thing. But if I let the viewer know that underneath their feet is buried a dead body, it changes everything for the viewer, not the characters, but for the viewer, because they know something and they are thinking about something that isn't there, you know, but for the characters. So it's a similar kind of thing when you're talking about them looking at rather than through the glass.
Yeah, and ultimately, it's about a good story and it's about human beings, isn't it? It's like when you tell a story on television, it's kind of like being around the campfire. You know, there's
Yeah.
something primordial there, isn't there? About it's just the power of a story. And if you believe that story, then it's real to you. I like to tell people, look, Bigfoot's real. UFOs are real, because to the person who believes it, it is real. I mean, do we know what's going to happen if space aliens visit Earth? We do, because it happened. It happened on October 30th, 1938 for some people.
Yeah.
How did they react? Right? And there have been several outbreaks similar to that. There was a case in Ecuador in the late 1940s where over a dozen people were killed. They had a similar broadcast to that of the War of the Worlds. And at the end of the day, the military and most of the police went to the nearby town of Catacalo to fight what they thought were the Martians. They left a skeletal police force there in the city of Quito. And when people realized it was a fake broadcast, they surrounded the building with a radio station and burned it down, killing over a dozen people. It was really a remarkable event. And these cases have a tendency to, you know, it's like a bowling ball. Once they start, and once you release the ball, you can't control where it goes, just like a rumor,
Yeah.
right? It's the same thing as a rumor. People say, oh, such and such started a rumor. No, because when you start it, when it got told to the next person, it morphs.
Yeah.
And it's going to morph reflective of what the cultural coloring is and everything that's going on right now. I mean, I'll make a prediction for you. Recently, they had on 60 Minutes, they were talking about they might have had Havana syndrome energy attacks near the White House. Mm-hmm. Well, that being the case, and if there are White House officials now who I have no doubt believe that there may have been attacks near the White House, and there's a foreign power, possibly the Russians, that have the ability to do this. Right now, we are in the fog of war with what's going on in Ukraine.
Yeah.
With that tension and with the belief that the Russians are behind Havana syndrome and they got some new secret energy device and they're pointing it at American diplomats to make them sick, there's a really good chance that in the coming days and weeks, you will get a wave of people who work in the White House or the vicinity of the White House who wake up some morning and feel a bit dizzy and maybe had a bit too much to drink the night before and have a headache, nausea, and think that they were actually the target of some secret sophisticated weapon, when in fact that was going to happen to them anyway, because they're human beings and human beings have symptoms like that.
Yeah, I was going to pause it, but I just want to pick up on your point about the Quito radio station, because people could argue, well, this belief in aliens, belief in the Virgin Mary, ultimately this is harmless. But then I was when you take into account, for example, the experiments done by Stanley Milgram and then also Zimbardo and the Philip Zimbardo and the Stanford prison experiment, it gets into the kind of thing, the mask effect, where if you give people power, and also that the lady, the teacher who did the blue eye, brown eye experiment with the kids, you you see how easily manipulated people are, and you can see that just going back in recent history with the giving up of constitutional rights after 9/11. You know, we have to stop this enemy, this that. Talk a little bit about the darker side of things with Zimbardo and Milgram, and how easily people are swayed into acting against what seemingly should be their moral foundations.
That was Jane Elliott
Jane Elliott, yeah,
and the so-called blue-eyed experiment done right after the assassination of Martin Luther King
yeah,
in the latter 1960s. And she had taken her class of elementary school children, and I believe it was Riceville, Iowa. And she told one group, she based it on eye color. And one group that had a certain eye color was said to be inferior to another group. Now, look, you couldn't do this today, you'd lose your job, but
yeah.
she was well known in the community, and they allowed her to do that experiment. But you certainly couldn't do it today. There would be serious issues. You probably would be unemployed. And it just showed how quickly people started to discriminate against this other group and take on the belief. The Stanley Milgram experiment was very interesting because they gave people electric shocks, or what they thought were electric shocks. And they were told to keep shocking them. The person was going, no, no, please, don't shock me anymore. And the person in the lab coat would say, no, please continue. And what they thought was the vast majority of people would not continue giving what they thought were potentially harmful electric shocks, when in fact, they did. A significant number of people did that. And that was a parallel with the Nazis in World War II in terms of, Nazis. I always tell my students, you give me a 6-month-old baby, and I'll give you the best citizen and an A student that you've ever seen, or I'll give you the best little Nazi you've ever seen. Because it's the power of bad programming, isn't it? There was an ice cream stand in upstate New York in this little place called Hampton. At least it used to be there. And when you went there, you ordered your food, and they always called you by your first name. Robert, your order is ready. They wouldn't give you a number. And they had a little sign there that you couldn't miss as you were ordering your ice cream and your chili dogs. And it said, mean people create little mean people. It's the power of that in conformity. I mean, if you look, the prisons are filled with people who were physically, emotionally, and sexually abused as children. And you would think that that is the last thing that someone who's had that done to them would do to somebody else. Yet, the literature says differently. The literature says that people are much more likely to reproduce that behavior. Bad programming. These are damaged people. And most of these people are not born, they are created. And they are victims. Their victims are victims, but they are victims as well. And it's very difficult to undo the damage that has been done in a situation like that. I mean, the Zimbardo experiment, they had to stop it after 6 days in the basement of Stanford University when they asked for students who got paid to be guards and prisoners in this prison experiment. And it got so out of hand, the guards started abusing the prisoners, and they stopped it. And it just goes to show the power of seemingly ordinary people to do extraordinary things under the pressure of conformity.
But also, in recent years, there have been some of the people who participated in it, and even Zimbardo has admitted that he either not knowingly, maybe, but unknowingly, goaded part of the guards to act a little bit over the top too. So he himself was caught up in his very own web, in a sense.
Absolutely. And then he wrote a book on Abu Abu
Yeah,
Ghraib,
yeah.
and I'm trying to think of where that was.
Iraq,
Where was that?
Iraq.
Yeah, yeah. And how far those soldiers went,
Mm.
right, in terms of dehumanizing other people. And that is, that's the powerful lesson here, is that we're all human. No one is immune. And we have to keep educating ourselves about the potential to dehumanize. Um, there is always that potential. I mean, look at what happened with the Jews during World War II. The United States hadn't nearly reached the quota of German Jews who they could take from Germany, but because there were anti-Semites in the State Department who rationalized that, oh, some of these Jews might be spies for Hitler. Probably not. And that's one of the reasons why we shouldn't be taking them. And in terms of civil rights, it's important not to point fingers of blame at any particular ethnic group, because by doing that, we demonize others and are really creating something that we are trying to prevent ourselves, right? And so it's so easy, though, to demonize others. It's easy to demonize Vladimir Putin as this evil person. But while I don't condone what's going on in Ukraine right now, there is a specific social, cultural, historical, political backdrop to what is going on.
Yeah, and a lot of it has to do with the Russian paranoia of being overrun by Eastern hordes over the centuries, overrunning the Tartars, the Mongols, the Huns, the this, the that. So I want to talk about a lot of things, but for time purposes, I wanted to speak in general about the metaphysical aspects of how people fall into believing in metaphysics, believing in the paranormal, the supernatural, the psi, the unexplained, whether we're talking aliens, although, if there really were aliens out there, they wouldn't be, they would become scientific. The belief in Bigfoot, I did a show on Bigfoot recently, just 2 days ago, I did a show on ghosts. What do you think compels people to believe in metaphysics, whether even we're talking about gods, the Abrahamic God, whether it's Zeus or Odin, and why are some things discarded? How did Jehovah, for example, outlast Odin and Zeus?
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. When you look at things like Bigfoot, UFOs, chupacabras, even the Loch Ness Monster, I view these as anti-scientific symbols in a secular age, where, for instance, you might have a sighting of Bigfoot down the road. Farmer Joe you went to school with Farmer Joe. I believe Farmer Joe, seeing is believing. Yeah. Farmer Joe saw Bigfoot. But these scientists in their ivory towers, they don't believe. And in a way, it undermines science. Oh, science also says that not only Bigfoot doesn't exist, but God doesn't exist as well. Well, if these scientists got Bigfoot wrong, well, maybe they got God wrong as well. I see a lot of transcendence and religious overtones in what's going on here. If someone sees a ghost, they don't just see a ghost. I mean, we know there are ghosts, 100%. They've done surveys around the world. People say they saw a ghost. The question is, what are the ghosts, right? Is it some kind of spirit of a deceased person? Or is it some type of hallucination? And I always say, if ghosts are real, how come they're not naked?
Yeah.
How come they're wearing clothing, right? I mean, that may suggest a psychological phenomena that's being reflected there. But I see that most people don't want to die. They want to believe that there is an afterlife. And that is the power of Bigfoot. That's the power of UFOs. And if you look at the alleged real encounters and the encounters from science fiction, like Star Trek and whatever,
Yeah.
the aliens are often said to live thousands of years or be immortal, have cured disease
Yeah.
because of their technology.
Yeah.
Well, if they were to share their technology, they could raise us to the immortal realm of the gods, right? And so that's the power of bringing this in. And so I see Bigfoot as actually reinforcing people's belief in an afterlife as this anti-scientific symbol.
Well, you know, it's interesting. A couple of days ago, I had mentioned I did a show on ghosts, and the two fellows who I spoke to there, one of them brought up a very interesting point about how ghosts have evolved over the centuries. And he said that the biggest thing that gave us our modern idea of ghosts was the spiritualism of the 19th century, because before then, in the West at least, where we believed in ghosts, some cultures don't have ghosts, but in the West, ghosts were not immaterial. When you thought, just think of Hamlet. When Hamlet's father comes back as a ghost, he's presented not as a wispy thing, a voice off stage, an actor is playing, because that's the way they saw ghosts then. Spiritualism came along, and they'd had a lot of smoke and mirrors, you know, the whole thing. And this is where they said that the idea of the wispy ghost that you could see through came. And so there's a perfect example of the culture just sort of wrenching pre-existing mythos into something else and just changing it. You know, it went in one way and came out another.
Yeah, and I think it's important when looking at this phenomena to realize it's a social phenomena. It changes with time, like the incubus succubus to what it is today. And that offers us important insights as to what's going on, that it's a social phenomena. And we can't necessarily look at this through the lens of physics or chemistry or things like that. There's a famous cultural anthropologist, Clifford Geertz, who said that man is a creature suspended in webs of significance that he himself has spun. I take culture to be those webs, and the analysis of it, therefore, not an experimental science in search of law, but an interpretative one in search of meaning. And that's so important because you have to, as you're investigating these in different cultural settings, decode the cultural conducts that are going on. It's so easy to look at something and to think through the lens of 21st century American perspectives and prisms and try to look at something 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago. It's so important to understand the cultural, historical backdrop of what's going on. I mean, look at Kim Jong-un and North Korea. I mean, some of the stuff he does looks just totally bonkers, but I have no doubt if I grew up as him, I'd be doing the same thing. He has this unique backdrop to him that we don't fully understand, led to the behavior that he elicited, right? And so it's important to understand these outbreaks and the historical, cultural, religious, political, all these factors that are coloring what's going on at the time, that in some cases, historically, we may never fully understand.
Well, I want to talk about two more things that for the rest of the show. Well, one that's pretty much on the outskirts of things, and one that's very politically relevant today. I'll go with the lesser thing first. You in the book talk about stigmata, which is the blood appearing on the hands and the supposed Christ-like wounds. And it's interesting. I was watching a video a few hours ago, just skimming around YouTube, just relaxing while I was having lunch, and I saw a video where a pro wrestler, a famous pro wrestler here in the U.S. Named Stone Cold Steve Austin, has a podcast where he talks with other old wrestlers, and they were talking about one particular match where they would cut themselves and make themselves bleed to juicing to get the fans riled up and because when you see blood, it's real when you see it. And I was thinking about that's interesting, and I wonder if the people, the stigmatics, if they are doing something very similar, even if unwittingly, some of them, like the nuns you mentioned earlier, who have convulsing. Talk to me about stigmata and the blood and the manifesting, that kind of thing.
Well, for a long period of time, a lot of scientists were skeptical of that, right? And clearly, a number of people, famous stigmatas, were faking. However, there does appear to be a condition where you can have a similar phenomena develop with people who are have very unique sympathetic nervous systems. And but many of these people have been caught in terms of faking this as well. And this brings to the fore this whole idea, when you go back to Salem and stuff like this, were the girls faking? Well, sure they were. At times there was histrionics going on, and they were fanning the flames and making accusations about people they didn't like, right? But at the same time, there was a real phenomenon there as well. And so with the stigmata, you appear to have a number of cases where a number of prominent individuals have faked this. But also there is a medical condition where you can get some of this occurring as well. But it's not very common. And so these are, it's a combination of things, isn't it? I have no doubt that some of these people believe so much that they want others to believe as well, so they think it's okay to kind of hype it up a bit. And that reminds me of someone like George Adamski going from stigmata to this famous UFO contactee from the 1950s who claimed to talk to these Venusians and these
he wanted
beautiful...
to be special. He wanted to be special, right?
He wanted to be special, but I think that he likely suffered from what's known as a fantasy-prone personality, where he was able to go into this rich fantasy world where at times he kind of disassociated and was in that world. And he did things to fake. I think he had like a plaster cast, like he could have a Bigfoot, and he made it of an alien footprint of the person that he met, right? And so I think it's a combination of things that were going on there. There was another famous contactee, Truman Bethram, in the 1950s, who wrote a book aboard a flying saucer. And we got a hold of his original scrapbook that he had and he had made. In looking through that scrapbook, there was no doubt in my mind that he believed what was going on. And so I think there was some fakery going on, but at the same time, he had a condition, most likely fantasy-prone personality type of condition, where he actually believed he was having these encounters where he would lose touch with reality. A modern-day equivalent would be somebody like Whitley Strieber, who seems to exhibit the characteristics of a fantasy-prone personality as well. And often people with fantasy-prone personalities, as children, were isolated or had experiences that would have them go deep into a rich fantasy world. Like in the book, and this is really getting out there, the man who thought he was a cat, right? You don't just wake up one day and think you're a cat. He was tied up in the backyard as a child, as a punishment, and hooked to a chain, and then started making friends with the cats to the point where he had this rich fantasy world because he was out there alone with the cats, and he was having sexual relationships with these cats, right? And all kinds of really bizarre stuff. And this is a case that was investigated by a psychiatrist who was associated with Harvard University. I mean, this is a really legitimate case. It was in one of the mainstream medical journals, written up. So there's no doubt that this happened. And yet, this guy, when he got older, was able to fool people who didn't realize that he had this separate secret world, that he would go to the zoo and collect hair from I think it was the tiger cage, right? And he became inconsolable when the tiger, who he thought he was having a relationship with, I'm not sure how the tiger felt about it, but when it got transferred to another zoo, then he fell into this big depression, right? So it's, there's all kinds of fascinating phenomena out there that can give rise to unusual things, like lycanthropy, people believing that, they can turn into wolves. And, during the 16th and 17th centuries in France, there were more cases of alleged lycanthropy than there were of witchcraft. That's how common it had become. And so it's these beliefs and all these other psychological phenomena that people up until now have not been that familiar with, driving these things.
Yeah. Bethurum and Adamski, didn't they both claim to have gone to Venus and met Venusians, these tall Nordic type aliens, not the bug-eyed gray aliens, right?
Yeah, and curiously, that was a 1950s phenomenon.
Yeah,
right.
The Nordics.
And then after Betty and Barney Hill, and that that case became popularized by John G. Fuller's book, The Interrupted Journey. That then created the motif for the people being hypnotically regressed, because Dr. Benjamin Simon, the Boston therapist who regressed them and who said he didn't think they were real experiences, but when that book came out and became a bestseller, then all these people who claim to have missing time, and there's a variety of reasons why you might think you have missing time, these people then started to get hypnotically regressed. But if you go back, there was something similar with reincarnation in the 1950s and Bridie Murphy and people being hypnotically regressed into past lives. And they usually were a prince or a queen, right? Not a slave.
Well, everyone's Napoleon.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And
now the thing,
you
though,
got this going on. It's interesting. A friend of mine investigated a case in South Australia many years ago, and it was of a person driving in his car this long stretch. He'd been driving for hours and hours, and he was getting very sleepy. And all of a sudden, he saw this green, freaky alien walk across the road in front of him. And he said it startled him. Maybe, and the guy was very credible, maybe that's his subconscious mind saying, look, you're getting tired. You're going to drive off the road soon. You're going to get killed in a car accident. I need to do something dramatic to wake you up. And it did. And he was awake for the rest of the journey.
It's like people who only see something in the corner of their eye, something interesting, little creatures or things slipping out in and out. I did want to pick up though on Adamski and the Venus thing, because I remember I saw an old interview on the old David Susskind show years ago, and I think it's online, of Adamski being interviewed. And about 2 or 3 years ago, I interviewed actually 2 women separately about life after death, and one of them was against it, a woman named Susan Blackmore. I don't know if you've ever heard of her. And then another one, I forget her name, but she was a believer in life after death. And instead of going to Venus, she said that she was able to have out-of-body experiences, and she had flown past Pluto a dozen years or so ago. Now, this was just a couple of years after they had flown by, with actual spacecraft to map Pluto. And I said to her, I said, well, if you went past Pluto, if this was a real event, apparently Pluto has some very prominent features, topographical features. You should have said, oh, it has these features. You would be hailed as the genius. And I could tell she never even thought of that. She was like, but Adamski, on the other hand, always had a ready answer. So I think there were two separate types. She was a true believer in her powers, but didn't really understand how to make it others convince others. Whereas Adamski, I think, was the showman.
Yeah, and look, if people really do have psychic abilities, why aren't they rich? Why don't they, hit the
Yeah,
lottery? I mean, just play 1,000 numbers, right?
yeah,
And the same thing. Why don't you see psychic banned from casino again?
yeah.
I want to believe that people can predict the future. But what would that look like? I mean, we have 5 known senses that we're aware of.
Yeah.
And although
Well,
Trump may have more,
well,
right?
major senses. There are a few
Yeah,
others. I
yeah.
mean, I've seen there, but the 5 major senses. Yeah.
And
I wanted. Oh, go ahead.
yeah. So what would be like? We know roughly what these correspond to. So what sense would we have that would be able to know something that's going to happen before it happens? It would have to be so powerful.
Yeah.
I mean, where is it? Where is it in our minds? And what it was, Einstein said that we only use a small percentage of our brains. Well, my reaction to that is, who was Einstein? What does he know about brains? He was very
Yeah.
good in math, but
And
we
that's
keep
been
quoting
debunked too.
Einstein.
Yeah. The final one I wanted to talk about, and then we'll wrap up. You mentioned the Zoot Suit riots, and now just a year or so after the Black Lives Matter marches and stuff, here in the U.S., as we're recording now in the early part of 2022, these. I mean, I don't want to get into the total socio-political thing, but I think there was a lot of J. Edgar Hoovering going on, where agents of the U.S. government were trying to stir things up to discredit the Black Lives Matter movement after the George Floyd death. But going back to the Zoot Suit riot, there's a mentality that happens during protests, peaceful protests and riots. Talk to me about what sets off riots, because the common thread with the Zoot Suits and the Black Lives Matters, these are oppressed minority groups that are at the center of it.
And the Rodney King riots in
Yeah, yeah,
Los Angeles, I can remember when that happened. And what you get when those riots first break out, and you almost always get it, is people saying, oh, yes, they had a legitimate reason to be upset, but they've gone too far. Now they're breaking windows and they're taking stuff. But there's a reason they're breaking windows and they're taking stuff. Not that I condone doing that, but they feel aggrieved and they feel the system isn't working for them, and they are going to take what they think is, what they deserve because they have been oppressed by the system, right? And it's so easy in situations like that again, just like mass psychogenic illness, riots never occur in a vacuum.
yeah,
They build and they build. And if there had not been a history of police officers in the United States profiling people of color or certain ethnic groups, then it wouldn't happen. But there is that. And what's so fascinating to me is, in what the Jane Elliott blue-eyed experiment really showed, and she reproduced that over and over again on shows like Oprah, is that when you have a minority group in a society with the majority, and they live day by day with each other, the majority group has no clue the extent of the discrimination that's being felt by the minority group. And a great example is the O.J. Simpson trial. When that happened, you had students on university campuses who had lived together for years, who'd gone to classes together, who were, to simplify, black and white, in the same room looking at the same screen, and they said innocent. In some of those photos, you've got the black people cheering, and you've got the white students just stunned and couldn't believe it.
Yeah.
That only happens when you have a situation where, if you don't experience it every day, and you don't live with them, and you don't walk with them every day and go where they go. There is, in New Zealand where I live, there was a recent survey of about 2,000 Maori, the indigenous people here, who were asked about discrimination. And something like 89% said that when they go to shops, they feel that they're being watched and followed around. And I've never had that experience here as a Caucasian person. Yeah. And I never knew that until they did that survey. And then I started talking to people. I was talking to a friend of mine who was a teacher not that long ago, and I said, so when you go into a shop, and she was a Pacifica Islander, I believe Samoan, and I said, when you go into a shop, does it feel like people are following you? She goes, oh, all the time. I'm like, really? Because that's never happened to me. And I had never asked her that and never was aware of that. And so you've got this divide going on, right? Where then people say, oh, they're playing the race card. Yeah. Right? And it just spirals on from there. And it's so easy to kind of miss each other and misunderstand what's going on. There was a famous case in the I think it was the 1950s, where a journalist was able to go and had his skin changed. I think the book was Black Like Me. Yeah. And he went down into the Deep South and was experiencing what other people of color experienced. Yeah. And it was really shocking to him, the way he was treated.
You know, it's interesting. Since George Floyd, there have been a lot of cop videos that are dash cam videos that are on Facebook and YouTube that show, black people being stopped for no reason, being harassed. And it's interesting because I have friends on Facebook, and when I put these videos on my Facebook wall, they'll say, oh, well, they'll come up with the same excuses for this kind of oppression. And they'll say things like, well, these people, they have to earn it. They have to earn it. And it's like, they don't understand. I think when you have even a slight advantage, you don't understand the people that don't have the advantage. And it gets back to COVID, because for me, you think of all the things black people in America and Native Americans as well have suffered through, and they haven't gone on major killing rampages. Yet you get some privileged white person here in Texas. God damn it, I ain't gonna wear no goddamn mask for this government. You're infringing on my rights. Even though people will be dying because you're not wearing a mask or getting vaccinated. And there seems to always be in these situations that produce riots or civil unrest that can turn violent, there always seems to me to be a disconnect from the people on top. Even if they are well-meaning, they don't understand that even their well-meaningness can have a negative effect.
Yeah, and that, again, is the power of the milieu, the zeitgeist. I mean, if you take a police officer anywhere in the world, and they grow up in a household where they see cop shows all the time, and it's the black guy who's the drug dealer or the Hispanic guy who's the drug dealer, and they have certain stereotypical images. And then you become a cop, and they give you a 3-day course on ethnic and cultural awareness. Well, that's not going to change very much, right? And then you go out and you're expected to, not have biases or prejudices that have built up over the course of a lifetime. And you can't just take those things away. That's why I think in changing this, in changing the mentality of what's happened with the Black Lives Matter movement, the solution is not going to be revolutionary. It's not going to happen overnight. The solution has to be evolutionary. It needs to start in our schools at a young age and to break down those stereotypes so people grow up with other ethnic groups and being aware of and calling out stereotypes when they happen,
Well,
and being proactive. But it takes time.
critical race theory here in the U.S. Now it's not. Oh, the people who want to make known that racism has existed historically, the right wing will say, well, they're the racists now because they want to divide us, using the same rhetoric that they've using the rhetoric against them that was legitimate in an illegitimate way. But
yeah, and that's the great playbook, isn't it?
Yeah.
You reach into the playbook and you call them racist.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
well. Let me just wrap up. It was a terrific conversation. Like I said, it could go hours and hours just talking about everything here. I would highly recommend the book Outbreak, written by both you, Robert Bartholomew, and Hillary Evans. Anomalous books. I'll link to the Amazon page. I'll link to your webpage about it. Again, a really terrific discussion. So I thank you for spending a little over an hour and a half speaking with me.
It's been a pleasure.